So all of this comes down to a point where cognition, as we see it with perceiving and thinking, evolves in two stages. Perceiving pretty much encompasses the way we sense stuff, where thinking, on the other hand, is how we use this information and decide what to do with it. And there's a chap named Valiant who has been summarizing all of this research and said the way the brain works is probably approximately correct. This is what the brain tries to achieve. So it picks up the senses and say, okay, this is not a crocodile that's trying to eat me. Okay, I can put away my fear and anger mode right now and then just try to work with what I have. However, when we need to do something more complicated than fight or flight, it's a different game that we start up. And here Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, I don't know if one of you have read the book, which is called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, has taken up some really good and interesting things. And I'm going to test your brain on that in a second. First of all, Daniel Kahneman says that we have two ways of thinking. We have system 1 and system 2. And system 1 is our default thinking method. So suppose we are are told that revenues are $1,000, that expenses are $800, and we should calculate the income. We pretty quickly to look up there and then say, okay, 200 is the correct answer. And for obvious reasons, because this is system 1 behavior. You know, taking that and doing that calculation is something we are pretty confident about. And in most conclusions, you know, way more than 50% of us gets that right. And you are not even tentative in answering this question, saying what's the income. So now consider another example where I'm going to give you a bat that costs $1 more than a ball. And the bat and the ball together, they cost $1.10. So how much does the ball cost? And about half of us, they immediately say 10 cents, right? But we give this answer directly as we were given this task, and we actually feel pretty good about the answer. But the answer, however, is incorrect. It's not 10 cents, it's 5. And those who realize that it's 5 cents, they even probably thought first, hey, wait a minute, this is 10 cents. But then this guy up there, he's full of tricks, so I better just double check my calculation. Does it add up again? And then we start our, what Daniel Kahneman calls system 2 thinking. And what's really interesting here is that we actually, in the first round, felt pretty good about the 10 cents answer to it. But then, if we need to really go in and evaluate it, we should probably switch to a different type of algebra and then start calculating this way. So Kahneman, he says that this stuff happens really, really frequently when we try to make decisions, try to think about it. And what more broadly happens is that our system 1 gives us no indication that we were mistaken in the first round. We had that first initial idea, and then it's only because there's a context here where I created suspicion that we then start, wait a minute, how does this work? So alone this is that our system 1 doesn't really lie to us, rather it gives us an assessment of the immediate situation, and then the trouble starts. It answers a different question than what is asked of it. And being able to hold that back is hard work. Now, so we could say in a way we should always use system 2 thinking. And there are several reasons why we simply do not and we cannot do that. First of all, if we applied system 2 thinking all the time, one of the things that would happen is that it would drive us completely crazy. We would trust nobody, nothing, nowhere. And we would start doing a complete checking of it, and it would end up in a situation where we're looking at a manager and he's thinking, okay, this guy, he might have a nice suit, but he's a complete case of obsessive compulsive disorder with fact checking. And to my knowledge, those guys don't last long in business environments. So we have to take some gambles. So first of all, that's one side of it. We would detect that constant system 2 behavior. The other thing is that we simply cannot sustain system 2 thinking. If we need to concentrate about this for a long time, it is literally exhausting. Okay, so system 2 thinking is difficult, and it doesn't necessarily also either give us a correct answer. The bat and the ball problem here is best approached by algebra, and we all expect to make mistakes when we do algebra. So there's more to it. A fourth reason why we don't use system 2 is that we actually don't see a need to do so. In this revenue and expense problem, you are probably very comfortable with the answer. but when we don't necessarily are forced to think about whether we are right or wrong. Sometimes, of course, we are right, but often we end up in this trap that our brain answers a different question than the question which was actually asked to us. So when it comes across this, I've been studying optimization methods, and when people go out and say this is a perfect business case and this is exactly the framework that we need, and they often end up in the same trap. And this is where we start looking at large volumes of data, and then we expect that the people around us can still keep crunching the numbers in their spreadsheets, and they literally suffocate under all the data that is available. So knowing your library, again, being demand-driven, but tech-aware, and knowing where to plug in many of these new tools is probably where you could get most benefits in terms of decision-making quality and also testing some of your assumptions. Let's say if you push the envelope of this and you have a little more of tools available to it than just the spreadsheets, you could get a much stronger decision-making process out of it. Another approach is simply just to think about how we work. I've put together a little example here where we do in IT, we look at validation, we look at revenue, cost, and income. Here's an example. And then we simply create a model where we say, have we evaluated all the cases for true? Have we taken up the overview where we see that we're checking individual items in our spreadsheets and then coming back to it? There is a conference every autumn, August, September, on which is called the European Spreadsheet Risk Group, which was asked to look after some of the problems that came out of the banking crash, where decimal errors literally cost millions of losses to retirement funds, and then trying to figure out what to do with it. And they've inspired very much in this model here to start saying, okay, when we start using the data and we get it in, so all sums needs to add up. You know, when we take all our revenue, if we've allocated it out over our customer groups and maybe out over our product groups, when we start adding all of these up, we might check them manually, but maybe it's better just to put in a framework that then locks it from the beginning, instead of just going with the gut feeling that system one says, hey, we're ready, let's just stick to that one. So for that, it's nice with spreadsheets, but don't get cheated by your own mind. The next thing is enabling that social synergy that we then want to take in, and we still want to keep the brain involved. We want to let people drive the change, and we need to put people together to achieve their goals. And here's also some cases which I've found over the last 10 years which are just repeated, and I'm tired of them because they just show up again and again and again. First of all, some people, they launch out with having a mission without an end goal. Okay? So this big IT project that we're not now investing 100,000 IT hours in, 40,000 internal, 60,000 consultants, we got multi-million-dollar support on it. What is it really we want out at the other end? Is it just a dream machine where all the problems go away? I haven't seen it. And every time somebody tries to formulate it, we normally see that we rip it apart because we can't agree on it. So that's one of them. The other one is, another one I see is that some people, they are obsessed by innovating basically for the sake of producing new ideas. That might be a very good business area to work in pure R&D, but again, we get stuck in it. I know academia suffers heavily from it. They don't know where to take it on. And then another thing which probably is more cultural, but I've seen that in many cases where we give responsibility and we say, oh, I like you to be completely take ownership of this division and then get it rolling. And it's fine, but again, it forces us into a way where we think now we just take focus on this thing instead of maybe turning the question around and asking, how do we take ownership and what does it actually take you to enable you to it? So when I look across a lot of managers who initiate small change project and change management project, I see that they are often focused on serving those who are higher up in the hierarchy, where actually they should be asking themselves, those who are really the front line to my customers, they need to serve the customers. And the management who is then serving the front line, and the executive management needs to serve so on and so on. So instead of trying to be caught in a stressful conflict between serving my boss and serving the customer, maybe it's just a question about resetting expectations and saying, listen up, who are we actually here to serve? Jeff Bezos from Amazon, he's done that with brutal force. He has a business card where he says, don't forget who runs a business. And he doesn't mean him, he means the customers. And that's where everybody should be focusing in Amazon, namely to keep providing what the customers need. On the other side, we also see that, for example, banking is notorious for giving responsibility. But they also have the highest stress rate of people ever. Okay, so if you can work 15 years in banking without being stressed, either you have some really good sleeping medicine, and I would like to know about the prescription then. Otherwise, you are really hardcore in just freezing down your frame and eliminating the problems. And all of us who are gentle spirits, we normally suffer a little bit when we need to just be completely cynical about peers who actually want to do something, but then are not in a position where they can actually make the change happen. So grading that and understanding their limitations is a key in achieving that social synergy. Prototyping, which is kind of the next thing, is something where I think we have been very good at just picking up from the early startups and saying, how do we launch a new division, or how did we, for example, launch the beginning of e-tailing and take that in. We almost launched it in some cases like a separate business. And we've been good at taking on those entrepreneurial models where we've gone from a feasibility study to some stage 1 funding, stage 2 funding. But I think we often get a little bit sleepy when it comes to the pilot study and then scaling it out internally. If it's a new business unit, fine, clear borders, everybody knows where it is. But if it's internal, we stick with the legacy. We stay in system 1 thinking. We don't remove ourselves from that box. And this is where often I wonder, how deep do we actually go into the stack, and we ask ourselves before we say, now this is a management decision that we want to roll out. I mean, if we say how many here are actually capable of launching some changes without doing first a pilot study? Just roll it out, just no risk. Okay, good, we're over that one. With pilot study, when you then start rolling out and you know there are scalability issues, do you break down your projects into an R&D part where you say, we don't actually know what these concepts look like? There's this guy over there, he talks about cloud. I'm afraid of heights. You know, what is he talking about? Or are we talking about that people have a clear idea of those new concepts and how to actually interact with them? R&D, separating out. Do we even have focus on that on our business plan? I see many Gantt charts, and none of them pull it out and make it explicit. So when it comes to going through from R&D, applied R&D, and then going into deployment mode, are we really good at separating those phases out? Or do we, again, let system 1 thinking take over and just say, it worked on my laptop, let's roll it out to all our servers. And then we see disasters pending to happen. So that's a clear question that leaves open. Another thing is some organizations, they simply don't change their organization to actually suit the change. I would bet that 80% in here have been experiencing that. We take on new tasks, we take on new changes. By the way, could you cut the headcount by 20%? Okay, that's just a classic one. And by the way, we need to start tomorrow because we don't have time to train or increase understanding of it. So doing that preparation and becoming very conscious about when we jump to those conclusions is what I worry about when people say, okay, let's make the future of the supply chain and then put in the changes that we want to create. We got to go through that whole tedious engineering process to rip it apart and understand how it works. By the way, I don't know what you call when you depart from legacy process. Maybe somebody can help me in here. What's the latest buzzword for that? In German, the government, they launched a report where they call it innovation management. That's where you just make the legacy processes disappear. I guess it's a follow-up from Industry 4.0. Good. Now, the last thing, and you heard me this morning already on it, is you need data for that process. And I think a lot of people, they launch way too far into the process without ever getting the data right. There is a clear consequence of that. Not only that we manage the data with assumptions about what really needs to happen, but we take it way too prematurely and jump to conclusions. How many here have just had a business case where they say, this is a brilliant business case, and then when they kind of start handing over the project to those who need to implement it, they see, okay, there's a stack of assumption where we just basically go, O, A, E, and then the card house falls apart. I've seen it at least 5 times over the last 10 years. The next thing is on the de-risking of the projects. I think one of the most impressive companies when it comes to making innovative changes is DARPA, the US Defense Administrative Research Program administration. They throw in really groundbreaking research, and then they expect industry to then start picking it up and doing something about it. And there is this quadrant built up from Donald Stokes, who says that he looks after whether it's practical and whether it's necessary for fundamental understanding. And if it's not practical but fundamental, he calls it the Borg quadrant. And otherwise, he says that it's where it's user-inspired practical and still necessary. It's a Pasteur model, long story for it. But the real balance that comes around is Bohr is more work with curiosity-driven research where we try out different options. We make small experiments and we innovate. Edison's quadrant up there is pretty much pure applied research where you go in and say, okay, we have this strategic capability we would like to have, but we need somehow to get that in to the organization at a later stage. Typically, when people talk big data right now, that's what they mean. If they put a product tag on it, I'm pretty sure that half the group who's listening in on it don't know where they're taking it. Pasteur's quadrant, as the other one, is expanding basic scientific knowledge and then just trying to push our societal needs. Industry uses that very much when it comes to finding standards. How do we go about it? So, and then there is the unnamed quadrant, which doesn't really require any, because if it's not for practical use and not fundamental research, I guess it's something else. I don't know. Entertainment? Good. So with that, what is really interesting is that the concepts which are taken apart breaks it down into that most projects of change that we present, they contain all three classes. They both contain some places where the concepts are new. They're pretty pure R&D. We've never worked with it. We've never seen it before. The next one comes in where we do some combinations of those new concepts, and then we call it applied R&D. And at the end of that, we see then finally we need to go into deployment where we have maybe never worked in that environment before. And this is again where we need to ask ourselves a question. When we formulate these Gantt diagrams and these projects for change to, again, designing that supply chain that we are pursuing, are we de-risking our projects by looking critically, not about what were the milestones according to the business plan from the top management, but what are the milestones in a manner where we de-risk the project by first making sure that we got all the new concepts and we don't need to worry about any of the new components, that we have a clear idea after that how we combine these components and bring them together in a coherent entity. And then finally, of course, when we go out and deploy them. I can give you tons of examples. I'm sure if you just have 10 seconds to think about it on your own, there could be a benefit in going and shifting around project the way we design them, from going just trying to meet some deadline or some launch date, but actually thinking, how do we coordinate so we de-risk it up front? So, I put in the frog. So if you don't remember anything else, at least there was a bit of green on the screen. But any questions to this one? I hope what you take away from here is that when you go in and think about how you're going to create the change program for the supply chain to make the change you need, keep in mind what is system 1 and 2 thinking, and then de-risk your projects, because otherwise I would call it gambling, and that's not what our engineering discipline should be known for. Thank you very much.